The streets of Whitechapel. London, in the year of 1888, was a city that never truly slept. Even when its grander neighbourhoods quieted into the hush of midnight, the East End, and especially the district known as Whitechapel, remained restless. This corner of the city was a place of endless noise, movement, and hardship. It was not the London of wide boulevards, carriages, and glittering lamps. It was not the London of gentlemen's clubs, of opera houses, or of fine houses by the river. No, Whitechapel was another world, and it was here, in its narrow lanes and shadowed courts, that the figure who would one day be remembered as Jack the Ripper found his stage. To understand how deadly Jack the Ripper truly was, one must first understand the ground he walked on, the streets that bore witness to his steps, and the lives of the people who struggled there. For Whitechapel was not a place of peace. It was not even a place of steady survival. It was instead a district defined by overcrowding, poverty, desperation, and a darkness that clung to its crooked alleys as persistently as the London fog. The East End had long carried a reputation. Even among Londoners, who were themselves no strangers to crime and disorder, the East End was spoken of with a kind of grim respect and weary caution. It was where the poorest of the poor gathered, where new arrivals to the city sought cheap lodgings, and where the press, when they wished to stir alarm, often looked for their stories. In Whitechapel alone, some 80,000 souls were packed into streets that seemed too narrow for half their number. Families were crammed into single rooms, and those too poor even for such meagre lodgings sought beds in common lodging houses, where for a few pennies a night they might claim a space in a shared dormitory or even just a portion of floor to stretch upon. The houses leaned toward one another, damp with years of soot and rain. The bricks were worn down, the roofs often sagging, and the windows, when they had glass, were dim with grime. In some courts, the air itself seemed to carry sickness, for sanitation was poor, and refuse often collected faster than it could be removed. Children played barefoot in the muck, their faces pale from malnutrition, while their mothers bent over washtubs, earning a few pennies with laundry. Men stood idle in doorways, unemployed or underemployed, sometimes turning to petty crime or drink to soften the edges of their lives. And then there were the lodging houses, places that even journalists of the time described with unease. In one such house, a man could rent not a bed but a space on a rope, strung across a room, where dozens leaned forward to sleep while hanging by their armpits, their heads drooping against their chests. For a few pennies more, one might claim a shared bed, but even then, it was not uncommon for strangers to lie side by side, packed together in ways that stripped rest of any comfort. Disease spread easily in such conditions, and so did despair. In the evenings, the streets of Whitechapel grew busier still. The gas lamps flickered in patches, leaving long stretches of shadow where crime might stir unseen. Vendors called out their wares, selling roasted chestnuts or cheap cuts of meat. Ragged children darted between the crowds, hoping for a coin or a crust of bread. Women, many with no other way to earn a living, lingered in doorways or along street corners, seeking customers who might offer them the means to pay for their lodging for that night. For in Whitechapel, survival was often measured not in years or months, but in single nights. It was in this world that fear could take root so easily, because those who lived there were already worn down by daily battles. The men and women of Whitechapel were accustomed to hardship. They were accustomed to crime, to hearing of stabbings, thefts, or drunken fights. But nothing could have prepared them for the kind of violence that would soon descend upon their streets. Nothing could have prepared them for a killer who struck not in anger, nor in a sudden quarrel, but with cold calculation, leaving behind not only death, but a message of terror written in the wounds of his victims. Before the first strike of the knife, though, the stage was being set. The fog rolled in from the Thames, curling like a veil through the alleyways. The sound of carriage wheels on the distant thoroughfares faded as one stepped deeper into Whitechapel's warren of lanes. There were courts so narrow that neighbors could reach across and touch hands from their windows. There were dead ends where lantern light could not reach, and where the silence pressed in uncomfortably thick. It was in these spaces that Jack the Ripper would find opportunity. But in 1888, in those first days of August, the people of Whitechapel did not yet know his name. The newspapers, of course, painted their own picture of the district. They wrote of the outcast London, of places where the respectable citizen dared not walk alone. Journalists came to Whitechapel, not only to report but to gawk. Some came guided by police, others led by charitable organizations seeking reform, and still others wandered in on their own, notebook in hand, writing of what they saw with equal parts fascination and horror. Their descriptions helped shape the way the rest of London viewed the East End, as a place of hopelessness, a place of danger, a place separate from the more comfortable quarters of the city. But those who lived there knew that Whitechapel was more complex. There was crime, yes, and misery, yes. Yet there was also resilience. Families clung together, neighbors looked out for one another, and there was laughter even amid the hardships. The sound of singing drifted from the public houses, where for a penny one might buy a pint of beer and forget the cold for a little while. Street musicians played fiddles or hurdy-gurdies, children danced in the lamplight, and women gathered to gossip as they waited in line at the water pumps. Life, even in Whitechapel, had its rhythms, its moments of joy. This is what made the events of the autumn of 1888 so particularly terrible. Into this fragile balance of hardship and hope stepped a killer who would magnify every fear, every shadow, until the entire district seemed to live beneath a cloud of dread. The people of Whitechapel were not strangers to death, but they were strangers to the kind of death that Jack the Ripper brought. His murders were not only brutal, they were theatrical in a way, almost staged, as if meant to be discovered, meant to shock, meant to send a message. And it was this, more than anything, that made him deadly. Yet before the first murder was discovered, the streets went on as they always had. Women searched for customers in the early hours of the morning, their shawls pulled tight against the chill. Men stumbled drunkenly from taverns, their boots echoing on the cobblestones. The smell of coal smoke clung to the air, mingled with the sharper stench of refuse, horse manure, and rotting food. Fog hung low, softening the glow of the lamps and giving the world an otherworldly haze. It is within this haze, dear listener, that we must settle for a while, to truly see the world that Jack knew. Imagine yourself walking those streets, the uneven stones beneath your feet, the damp seeping through your shoes. Hear the voices in the distance, some calling cheerfully, some raised in argument, some muttering in desperation. See the shadows that seem to shift just beyond the corner of your eye. In Whitechapel, darkness was not only a matter of the night. It was a matter of life itself. And so, as we begin this long account of Jack the Ripper, we do not yet look upon the killer himself. Instead, we linger in the streets that shaped him, that sheltered his movements, and that carried the echo of his footsteps long after he was gone. For to understand the terror he unleashed, one must first understand Whitechapel, the heart of his dark theatre, and the stage upon which his legend was carved. Chapter 2: The First Murder. By the end of August 1888, the streets of Whitechapel were alive in their usual restless way. Smoke hung thick over the narrow alleys, curling like lazy ghosts around the crooked rooftops and sagging eaves. The clatter of wooden cart wheels on uneven cobblestones mixed with the distant clamour of church bells and the occasional shout of street vendors peddling vegetables, roasted chestnuts, or second-hand goods. Life in Whitechapel was seldom quiet, and yet there were hours when even the city's ceaseless noise softened into a heavy, oppressive hush, the kind of hush that made one more aware of shadows and distant footsteps. Mary Ann Nichols, a woman known to those who passed her on the streets as a Polly, had lived a life defined by hardship. She was 38 years old, her years spent moving from place to place, struggling to survive, her hands hardened by labor and her eyes carrying the quiet fatigue of someone who had endured far more than anyone should. Like many women in Whitechapel, she relied on the streets themselves for her survival, walking them in search of customers, in search of a small sum of money that could pay for a night's lodging or a modest meal. That night, August 31st, the streets were damp with a recent rain, the air thick with fog that muffled the usual sounds and made the lamps cast dim halos on the wet cobblestones. Polly had been walking, as she often did, weaving through alleys and courts that were too narrow for proper light to reach, past people who barely noticed her or regarded her with weary disinterest. In Whitechapel, many moved as if always balancing on the edge of something unknown, their minds occupied with hunger, shelter, or the next day's uncertain prospects. No one saw her final moments as she passed along Bucks Row. The street was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if the city itself had paused. And in that pause, a presence awaited. The killer moved with a careful precision, choosing the moment and the place where no one would see, where no one could intervene. His hands were steady, his mind unflinching. The violence that followed would be the first in a series of murders that shook London to its core. Polly's body was discovered in the early hours of the morning, lying on the ground, cold and lifeless. The street seemed almost to recoil from her presence, the fog wrapping around the scene like a shroud. Passers-by, those who came upon her by accident, felt a mixture of shock and horror. The local constables were summoned, their boots echoing on the damp stones as they approached. They had dealt with crime before, but the sight that greeted them was unlike anything they expected. There was an undeniable sense of method, of careful execution, in the placement of her body and the nature of her wounds. News of the murder spread quickly through Whitechapel. The residents, who had grown accustomed to petty thefts, brawls, and other misfortunes, now felt the icy touch of fear. The newspapers, ever eager to capture the city's attention, reported in vivid detail, describing the crime scene with dramatic language that would both horrify and fascinate the public. Londoners, even those far from the East End, began to whisper about the nature of the streets they had previously ignored. Whitechapel was no longer merely a place of poverty, it had become a place of terror. The investigation began immediately, yet progress was slow. The constables moved from street to street, questioning witnesses and neighbours, but in Whitechapel, people often kept their own counsel. Some feared the law, others feared reprisal from criminals, and many simply wished to survive another night. Information came in fragments, each piece of evidence seeming to lead to another uncertainty. And in the midst of this uncertainty, the killer remained invisible, moving silently through the fog, observing without revealing himself. For the residents, the murder of Mary and Nichols was not just an isolated act of violence, it was a signal. The streets they had walked daily, the courts they had passed countless times, had been claimed, if only temporarily, by a predator whose reach and purpose were unknown. Anxiety settled over Whitechapel like a thick blanket. Doors were bolted more securely, footsteps quickened, and those who had previously moved without fear now glanced over their shoulders, wondering if the night would bring safety or death. The subtle horrors of that first discovery would echo in the days that followed. Residents spoke in hushed tones, telling of shadows that seemed longer, of noises that carried further, and of the peculiar chill that crept even through heated rooms. The local police force, though experienced, felt the pressure of a city watching and waiting for answers. Detectives traced footprints, noted the angles of alleys, and questioned witnesses, but the killer's cunning remained a step ahead of them. Mary and Nichols, in death, became the unfortunate introduction to the name that would soon terrify London, Jack the Ripper. While her life had been one of quiet struggle, her murder was loud in its effect, reverberating through the newspapers, the streets, and the minds of everyone who learned of it. The methodical and brutal nature of her death left little doubt that the person responsible possessed not only skill but a chilling detachment from human empathy. And so, Whitechapel began to change. Its residents, long accustomed to hardship, now navigated the streets with careful deliberation. Night walks became more cautious. Conversations at windows were whispered rather than spoken. The fog, once merely a feature of the London climate, seemed to thicken with menace, each curling wisp suggesting hidden eyes watching from the corners of alleys. Mary and Nichols had become the first note in a dark symphony that would play over the coming weeks, and the city, unprepared and unarmed, could only listen and shiver. Chapter 3: The Butcher's Method. In the days following the murder of Mary and Nichols, Whitechapel carried itself differently. The people who walked its narrow streets did so with awareness that had not been there before. Every corner seemed darker, every face in the fog a possible threat. And as news spread, so too did the whispered suggestion that this killing was no ordinary crime. The police had not revealed everything they saw at the scene, but the fragments that leaked to the public hinted at something far more chilling than a drunken quarrel or a robbery gone wrong. Mary Ann Nichols had not simply been murdered. She had been butchered. The word butchered carried particular weight in Whitechapel. Many of its residents worked in trades connected to slaughterhouses, tanneries, and meat markets. The sight of knives, cleavers, and blood was not unusual for those who lived there. But the murder of Nichols suggested a hand that moved with skill, as though the killer possessed a knowledge of anatomy, a familiarity with how flesh and bone fit together. The newspapers, ever eager to magnify public dread, seized upon this suggestion, and soon the idea of this East End butcher began to spread. When the body was examined, the nature of the wounds became clearer. The cuts were not random slashes born of rage or panic. They were deliberate. They were deep. They were placed in a manner that suggested intent rather than accident. To those who studied the remains, it seemed as though the killer had wanted more than to end a life. He had wanted to leave behind a message, one carved not with ink or words, but with steel into flesh. The notion of method was, in its way, more terrifying than the murder itself. Ordinary violence, though horrifying, could be explained by circumstance. A man might kill another in anger, in jealousy, or in desperation. A thief might stab his victim when discovered. Such acts, while tragic, fit into the framework of human frailty. But this was something different. This was violence performed with purpose, perhaps even with ritual. And that made it something that no one could easily understand or stop. Polly Nichols's death might have been seen as an isolated tragedy if not for what came next. On the morning of September 8th, just over a week later, the body of Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. Like Nichols, she was a woman struggling to survive, moving from lodging to lodging, earning what little she could. And like Nichols, her life was ended brutally, her body left as a grim testament to the killer's work. Annie's murder confirmed what many had feared. The wounds, once again, spoke of a steady hand and a cruel precision. Here, too, the cuts were not haphazard. They bore the marks of someone who knew where to strike, who knew how to cause not only death but disfigurement. And in Annie's case, the violence went further still, for parts of her body were removed. This detail, though not widely shared at the time, would later emerge as one of the most horrifying aspects of the case. It suggested that the killer took trophies, or perhaps conducted some grim experiment. This was the birth of what the papers now called the method. Each killing seemed to follow a pattern. The victims were women on the margins of society, attacked at night in dimly lit or secluded places, their throats cut swiftly, followed by mutilations carried out with apparent knowledge of anatomy. It was this pattern that bound the crimes together, transforming them from isolated tragedies into a series. And in that transformation, a killer became something else entirely, not just a murderer, but a figure of terror whose actions hinted at purpose, at repetition, and at a hunger that would not easily be sated. The The residents of Whitechapel absorbed this knowledge with growing dread. They knew that their streets were dangerous, but danger had always taken familiar forms. Knives flashed in drunken quarrels. Thieves struck from the shadows. But here was a danger that did not fit the known patterns. Here was a killer who moved like a phantom, appearing only to strike, then vanishing into the fog. And worst of all, he seemed to choose his victims from among the very women who most often walked the streets at night. For them, survival was already a precarious balance, dependent on finding customers and avoiding the worst dangers. Now, the very act of walking the streets became an invitation to death. The police, too, began to sense the method. Investigators noted the similarities, marked the time of night, the manner of attack, the type of victim. They sought to understand what sort of man could commit such acts. Was he a butcher by trade, his hands trained in the cutting of carcasses? Was he a doctor, familiar with human anatomy in ways few men were? Or was he something stranger still, a figure who killed not for gain but for reasons that defied ordinary logic? These questions haunted not only the detectives but the entire city. For once the idea of method was introduced, every new night carried the possibility that the pattern might be repeated. It was no longer a question of whether there would be another murder, but when. The newspapers, with headlines that seemed to grow bolder and bloodier with each edition, fanned the flames of fear. Illustrations, though often inaccurate, depicted shadowy figures with knives, looming over women in bonnets and shawls. Columns speculated about the identity of the killer, giving birth to theories that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some insisted he was a foreigner, brought to London by ship. Others believed he was a mad aristocrat, slumming in the East End for sport. A few even whispered that he was not a man at all, but something supernatural, for how else could he vanish so quickly into the night? Yet behind all the speculation lay the stark truth. The method was real, and it was deadly. Jack the Ripper, though the name itself had not yet been penned in his own mocking letters, was not killing blindly. He was killing with purpose. Each cut, each act of mutilation, deepened the terror, for they hinted at a mind not merely violent, but calculating. For those who sought rest in Whitechapel in those days, sleep did not come easily. The narrow rooms of the lodging houses were filled with whispers, with prayers, with the restless stirring of those who feared that the next scream in the night might belong to someone they knew, or to themselves. The very air seemed charged with unease, as though the fog itself carried the weight of a presence unseen, a presence whose methodical hand had already claimed 2 lives and was poised to claim more. And so, the butcher's method became not only a description of how the murders were carried out, but also a symbol of the dread that settled over London. It was the knowledge that someone walked among them with a purpose so dark, so precise, that ordinary explanations faltered before it. The pattern had been drawn, the stage had been set, and all of Whitechapel waited in fearful silence for the next act in the killer's unfolding play. Chapter 4: Fear in the Fog. By the time September of 1888 drew onward, the East End of London no longer belonged fully to its people. The familiar sounds of cartwheels, hawkers' cries, and children's laughter were still there, but beneath them ran something new, something unseen yet felt. It was fear. It settled like a second fog over Whitechapel, thickening every shadow and stretching every whisper into a rumour. The fog itself was no stranger to Londoners. It rolled in from the Thames with a steady persistence, swallowing whole streets, muting lanterns, and turning the air damp and heavy. But after the murders of Marion Nichols and Annie Chapman, the fog seemed to hold more than mist. It seemed to hold menace. For those walking the streets at night, every curl of vapour became a possible cloak for the killer. Every sudden stillness in the air became a warning. Fear did not come all at once, but like the steady drip of water seeping through stone. In the first days after Polly Nichols's death, some dismissed it as an isolated tragedy. After Annie Chapman, doubt began to shrink. When word spread of the mutilations, of the suggestion of skill and intent, fear rooted itself deeply, not only in Whitechapel but across London. People began to realize that this was no ordinary murderer. This was someone who killed with a method, someone who chose his victims carefully, and someone who had no intention of stopping. The streets responded accordingly. Women who once walked freely in the early hours now huddled together, moving in pairs or small groups. Lodging houses grew louder at night, filled with speculation, theories, and whispered prayers. Men kept closer watch over their wives and daughters, urging them not to stray into the darker lanes. Even the pubs and taverns, where laughter had once rung freely, now carried a more subdued air, the drinkers often lowering their voices when the subject inevitably arose. It was not only the working poor who felt the weight of fear. The newspapers carried the tales far beyond Whitechapel, into the parlours and drawing rooms of London's middle and upper classes. For readers in more comfortable neighbourhoods, the East End had always been spoken of as a place of crime and misery. But Jack the Ripper, as he would soon be called, turned those distant impressions into something immediate. The wealthy might not walk Hanbury Street or Bucks Row, but they read of them now with fascination and dread. And they asked themselves uneasy questions. If such brutality could flourish there, what might stop it from spilling outward? The police patrolled the streets with a more visible presence. Constables walked their beats more cautiously, their eyes sweeping over the darkened doorways and fog-laden alleys. Detectives pursued every rumour, knocking on doors, questioning men who seemed suspicious, speaking with butchers, slaughterhouse workers, and doctors alike. Yet their efforts seemed to achieve little. The killer left behind no clear trail, no reliable witnesses, no fingerprints or footprints that could be traced. He came like a shadow and vanished like smoke. In this absence of answers, imagination filled the void. Some believed the killer must be a man of medicine, perhaps a surgeon dismissed from his post, skilled enough to cut with such precision. Others insisted he was a foreigner, brought to London from distant shores, his cruelty explained by xenophobic fears of the unknown. Still others whispered of demons, of forces beyond human comprehension, because how else could a man commit such acts and remain uncaught? The fog itself seemed to encourage such thoughts. It distorted the world, hiding familiar landmarks, turning passers-by into looming silhouettes. A man walking quickly might appear, in the mist, as a figure stalking, a knife perhaps imagined in his hand. Even the sound of footsteps seemed altered, the rhythm echoing strangely in the muffled air, so that one could not always tell if the steps belonged to someone ahead, behind, or just beside. For those whose lives already depended on nightly wanderings, the fear was suffocating. And yet, life continued, because it had to. The women of Whitechapel still walked the streets, still sought customers, still balanced the meagre earnings of one night against the cost of a bed in a lodging house. Hunger and poverty were enemies more immediate than even Jack the Ripper, and for many, there was no choice but to face both. This was the cruelest part of the fear, knowing that even as danger grew, the necessities of life demanded that people remain exposed to it. The newspapers fanned the flames further, with headlines that grew larger and more dramatic. Illustrations showed dark figures looming in alleys, knives gleaming, while women cowered in fright. Each new article added weight to the fear, and yet also fueled a kind of fascination. People across the city began to follow the story not only with horror, but with a strange curiosity, as though Jack the Ripper had become both a nightmare and a grim form of entertainment. Crowds gathered at crime scenes, gawking at the places where bodies had been found, as though the air itself might still carry some trace of the terror. For those who lived in Whitechapel, though, there was no distance, no comfortable separation. Fear seeped into their daily routines, into their steps along the cobblestones, into their conversations at water pumps and markets. The fog that once merely dampened their clothes now seemed alive, a shroud in which danger waited. Every shadow was longer, every silence more profound. And always, the same question lingered. When would he strike again? This was the essence of the terror Jack the Ripper spread, not only in his killings, but in the silence between them. The pause became part of his method. Each night that passed without a murder did not bring relief, but deepened the dread of the night to come. The fog, patient and ever-present, became his ally, a cover under which he could watch, wait, and choose his moment. And so the people of Whitechapel lived, suspended in uncertainty, walking their streets with wary eyes, knowing that somewhere, hidden in the mist, a figure with a knife was waiting. Chapter 5. Letters from Hell. Fear alone might have been enough to shroud Whitechapel, but something else began to drift into the air that autumn of 1888. Words. They arrived not through whispers in taverns or murmurs at lodging-house tables, but on paper, in letters, written in ink that carried a mockery sharper than any blade. The police had been dealing with rumors since the first murder, but now they faced another kind of torment. Letters began arriving at the Central News Agency, at Scotland Yard, at local stations. Some were brief and clumsy, scrawled with accusations or theories, often unsigned. Others carried a deliberate cruelty, written as though from the killer himself. They seemed to take pleasure in the terror, to stir it further, to remind both police and public that the hand behind the murders was not only skilled with a knife but also eager to taunt. The most infamous began with the chilling salutation, "Eh, dear boss." It was dated late September, though it reached the Central News Agency in the final days of the month. The handwriting was uneven, the phrasing casual yet laced with menace. The writer mocked the police for their failures, laughed at their confusion, and promised more killings. He claimed he loved his work and would not stop until he was caught. There was even a grim jest about his knife being nice and sharp. It was not merely a threat, it was a performance, as though the killer had stepped onto a stage to boast before his audience. At first, the police debated whether the letter was genuine. After all, countless messages poured in, some written by pranksters, others by the morbidly curious. But the dear boss letter carried a detail that would linger in memory. The writer promised he would clip off a victim's ears as a form of signature. A promise that would later seem fulfilled, though not with exactness, in one of the coming murders. Not long after, another message arrived, this one a postcard, written in red ink, dated October 1st. It was shorter, brisker, but equally sinister. The writer again mocked the investigators, claiming the police would never catch him. It was signed with the phrase, "A Jack the Ripper." For the first time, the world had a name for the phantom that haunted Whitechapel. A name that would endure far longer than the fog or the fear, a name still spoken over a century later. There were still more. Among the most unsettling was what came to be called their ear from Helly letter. It arrived with a small box, and inside the box, wrapped in paper, was half of a human kidney. The note was crude, the spelling poor, the tone direct and mocking. The writer claimed the organ had been taken from one of his victims and offered to send the other half if the recipient wished. Whether genuine or not, the effect was chilling. The letter was addressed not to a newspaper or to Scotland Yard, but to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a man who had been pushing the authorities to do more. For him to receive such a message made the terror intensely personal. For the police, the letters were both distraction and humiliation. Every word had to be studied, every detail compared, yet the flood of fakes made it difficult to know which, if any, truly came from the murderer. Detectives passed the pages between them, weighing the handwriting, the phrasing, the rhythm of the sentences. Experts gave their opinions, but no clear truth emerged. The Ripper, if he wrote them at all, remained beyond their grasp, his taunts unanswered. The letters also transformed the murders into something larger. They became more than crimes. They became a narrative, a grim tale played out in ink and blood. The killer had a voice now, one that laughed at the helplessness of the law and the vulnerability of the poor. And the city itself seemed to listen, waiting with dread for the next word, the next body, the next proof that Jack was still at large. In the lodging houses, the words were repeated aloud, copied into memory, whispered at night. Women clutched their shawls tighter, men scanned the faces of strangers more carefully, and children asked their mothers what kind of man would write such things. The fear deepened, not because of what was written alone, but because of what the words suggested, that Jack the Ripper was not only killing but communicating, not only acting but performing. The fog of London, the dim lanterns, the crooked streets, all were his stage. And now, with his name inked on the page, his legend began to take shape. Not a nameless killer, but Jack the Ripper, a figure who mocked the world while moving invisibly among it. And so, as the autumn deepened, Whitechapel braced itself. For with the arrival of the letters, it became certain that more deaths were to come. Chapter 6: The Double Event. By the final nights of September 1888, Whitechapel's fear had grown into something almost tangible. The fog hung heavier, as though even the air carried the weight of dread. Men hurried home quicker after their shifts, women glanced back over their shoulders more often, and police patrols thickened in the narrow lanes. Yet, for all the extra steps, Jack the Ripper still moved unseen. Then came the night of September 30th. It would be remembered not for one murder, but for two. A night that Londoners would later call the double event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, a woman of 44, of Swedish birth, who had been in London for many years. She was known among her acquaintances as a Long Liz. Life had not been gentle to her. Her marriage had ended in sorrow, and she struggled with poverty like so many others in the East End. That night, she had been seen speaking with various men in the streets near Berners Street, where the shadows clung tightly between the small yards and passageways. It was near Dupfield's yard that she was found. The discovery came not from the police, but from a cart driver named Louis Deemschutz, who turned his horse into the yard just after 1 in the morning. His cart bumped against something on the ground. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth dropped carelessly. But when he stepped down and struck a match, the flickering light revealed the lifeless form of a woman, her throat cut. The scene was unusual compared to the Ripper's earlier crimes. There were no signs of the deeper mutilations that had marked his previous victims. Some would later wonder if the killer had been interrupted, perhaps startled by the arrival of Deemschutz's cart. The theory seemed plausible. The cut was deliberate, but the body showed none of the grim handiwork that had become Jack's signature. If he had been disturbed, it meant he had left unsatisfied. And if unsatisfied, perhaps he still prowled the night in search of another. That is precisely what happened. Less than an hour later, another woman walked into the darkness of Mitre Square, not far from Aldgate. Her name was Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old, weary from years of hardship, yet known for a spirited nature and occasional laughter even in the face of poverty. On that night, she had been arrested earlier for drunkenness but was released near midnight once she sobered enough to walk. Fate carried her into the square, a place that by day bustled with market life but by night lay still, shadowed, and empty. At around 1:45 a.m., Police Constable Edward Watkins stepped into Mitre Square during his beat. The light from his lantern fell upon a horror greater than any seen yet. Catherine Eddowes lay in the corner, her body savagely mutilated. The killer had not been interrupted this time. Her face was slashed, her abdomen opened, and organs had been removed. The violence was shocking even to officers hardened by years of city crime. Jack the Ripper had made up for the unfinished act of Berners Street with dreadful excess. The killings, so close in time and place, shook London to its core. News spread quickly the next morning, and panic deepened. The idea that the killer had struck twice in a single night suggested a hunger that could not be sated, a boldness that defied the police presence. No one could say where he had gone afterward. Had he brushed past the very constables who searched for him? Had he vanished into the alleys like smoke, while holding the blood of 2 victims still upon his hands? But the night's terror did not end at Mitre Square. As dawn approached, another discovery added to the mystery. Near Goulston Street, a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron was found, blood-stained, lying in a doorway. Above it, written in chalk, was a message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning was unclear, the spelling strange, yet it hinted at tension. The police debated whether the writing was connected to the killer or merely coincidence. Fear of inflaming anti-Jewish sentiment led authorities to quickly erase the chalk, but the strange clue lingered in memory. Had Jack the Ripper left it, or was it the work of another hand? The question remained unanswered. By morning, London's newspapers roared with the story of the double event. Illustrations showed the maps of the streets, the places where the bodies were found. Crowds gathered outside police stations, pressing for news. The Vigilance Committee met with even greater urgency, their calls for more protection now sharpened by the thought that the Ripper could kill twice in one night without capture. For the ordinary people of Whitechapel, the fear became unbearable. Women who had once braved the streets for survival now hesitated. Men, too, found themselves wary, for it seemed the killer moved like a phantom, escaping every effort to stop him. Conversations in pubs turned to whispers, and even children spoke his name with dread. Jack the Ripper was no longer just a murderer. He was a force that mocked law, mocked order, and mocked life itself. And as October dawned, the shadow over London only grew darker. The double event had shown the city that Jack was not weary, not slowing, but emboldened. He had taken 2 lives in one night and walked away unseen. The question on everyone's lips was simple, yet terrifying. When would he strike again? Chapter 7. The Autumn of Fear. The air in London during the autumn of 1888 was not only damp and heavy with the usual smoke of coal fires, but it seemed to carry something else, an unease, a restlessness that clung to the streets of Whitechapel. After the double event, no corner felt safe, no alley free from suspicion. It was as though the very cobblestones whispered of blood. Every evening, as the gas lamps sputtered into light, shadows pooled in doorways and stretched long along the walls. The working poor, who had always moved through these streets with weary familiarity, now walked differently. Feet hurried faster, conversations were clipped, and eyes darted about as if expecting a knife to emerge from the dark. Mothers pulled their children closer, and men who had once laughed loudly in the taverns now lowered their voices, as though their very words might draw the attention of the killer who stalked among them. The double event had taught them one terrible truth: Jack the Ripper was not bound by hesitation. He could kill once and kill again within the same hour, slipping past police patrols as though invisible. That thought alone haunted the minds of Londoners. If he could move so freely in one night, what prevented him from taking 3 lives, or 4? What if the next scream came from the house across the street, or from a sister, a wife, a mother? The newspapers swelled with speculation. Headlines screamed of a ghastly murder, and the fiend of Whitechapel strikes again. Journalists filled their columns with every rumour they could gather, some true, some wildly invented. They described the mutilations in grotesque detail, painting word pictures that burned into the imaginations of their readers. Some papers even received letters claiming to be from Jack himself, taunting the police, mocking the public, written in a hand that dripped with cruelty. Whether authentic or not, the effect was the same: fear deepened. One of these letters, later called the Dear Bossa letter, was particularly chilling. It carried the signature, Jack the Ripper. It was the first time the name appeared, and soon it spread everywhere, becoming the dark title by which he would forever be remembered. Before that, he had been the unknown murderer of Whitechapel. Now he had given himself a name that carried both arrogance and menace, as though he were proud of the terror he caused. And terror spread quickly. It was not contained to Whitechapel alone, but rippled outward across all of London. In the wealthier districts, men and women who would never set foot in the East End still shuddered as they read the morning papers. They pictured the narrow courts, the fog-shrouded lanes, the blood left glistening on the cobblestones, and they recoiled. The East End became not merely a poor part of the city, it became a hunting ground, a stage upon which the killer performed his gruesome work. The police, meanwhile, scrambled in desperation. Extra constables were sent into the streets, lanterns bobbing as they walked their beats through the night. Detectives followed tips, questioned informants, and prowled the taverns where whispers flowed freely. Yet, for all their efforts, Jack seemed always a step ahead. The very idea of his invisibility, his ability to vanish after killing, gnawed at the public trust. If the police could not protect them, who could? In this climate, suspicion grew like mold. Neighbors eyed each other warily. Any man seen walking alone at night might be watched with narrowed eyes. Foreigners, especially immigrants who had fled from Europe to the crowded quarters of Whitechapel, often found themselves the targets of blame. The strange chalk writing found after Catherine Edozer's death only fueled this mistrust. The words about the Jews lingered in memory, and though quickly erased, they left behind an unease that festered. The Jewish population of the East End, many of them hard-working tailors, butchers, and shopkeepers, suddenly felt the sting of suspicion. Crowds muttered about them in the streets. Some windows were smashed, some men threatened. Though the police cautioned against blaming any group, fear made people unreasonable. It was easier to turn suspicion toward a community than to admit that the killer might be anyone, even the man they greeted each morning. Meanwhile, women of Whitechapel, those whose survival depended on selling their bodies in the dark hours, lived with constant dread. Some still ventured into the night, hunger leaving them no other choice, but they did so with trembling hands and watchful eyes. They clutched shawls tighter around their shoulders, lingered near lampposts for safety, and tried to stay where people passed often. Yet deep down they knew Jack had struck in yards and squares, places not always hidden, and he could strike again anywhere. Taverns buzzed with stories, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Some swore they had glimpsed a figure fleeing after the killings. Others claimed the murderer must be a doctor, because of the way he removed organs. Still others whispered of secret societies, of rituals and strange purposes. The theories multiplied until they filled every corner of conversation. But behind the noise of gossip lay the silence of grief. The families of the victims mourned quietly, often without the means for proper burials. Their sorrow was overshadowed by the spectacle the murders created, yet for them it was not a tale of terror but the loss of a mother, a sister, a daughter. The shadow that Jack cast fell not only over the streets but into the hearts of the bereaved. As October deepened, the fog grew thicker, curling around lampposts and seeping through alleyways. Each curl of mist seemed to hide a figure. Each echo of a bootstep in the night made passers-by quicken their pace. London had faced crime before, countless murders and robberies, but never had it faced a killer who killed not only bodies but also peace of mind. The autumn of fear was more than a season. It was a weight pressing down upon an entire city, a gnawing dread that turned every night into a gamble. The gas lamps flickered, the watchman's whistles occasionally pierced the dark, and yet, despite the efforts, people felt as though they were living in the palm of the Ripper's hand. And in the silence, Jack himself remained unseen. Somewhere among the crowded lodging houses, the smoky taverns, or the bustling markets, he might have walked unnoticed, his face blending with the thousands. He was a phantom clothed in flesh, and he waited, perhaps, for the moment when the shadows grew thick enough to strike again. Chapter 8. A City on Edge. London in the autumn of 1888 was not merely a city going about its ordinary rhythms. It was a place trembling beneath the invisible hand of fear. The double event of September 30th had left behind more than the bodies of 2 women. It had left behind an atmosphere so thick with tension that even the fog seemed heavier, clinging to the skin like cold sweat. By the time the sun rose on the first morning of October, the East End was no longer the same. The Ripper had proven he could strike not once, but twice, and in a single night. That knowledge alone weighed down the residents of Whitechapel like an anchor. The markets still opened, for people still needed bread and coal, but the chatter of the vendors was subdued. Where once there had been laughter and bartering, now there were nervous glances over shoulders, lowered voices, and the hushed exchange of the latest rumours. Every butcher's apron stained with red, every fishmonger's knife glinting in the weak sunlight, every sudden sound in the street, all of it became reminders of the Ripper's hand. The city seemed to be listening, as though it expected the man himself to step from behind any shadow at any moment. The newspapers carried much of the blame for how thickly the fear spread. Each morning and evening, headlines screamed in bold black print, "Another murder in Whitechapel," or "The Fiend strikes again." Though the journalists themselves had no answers, their words poured like oil onto the fire of panic. Columns speculated wildly about the killer's identity: a butcher, a foreign sailor, a mad doctor. Even members of the aristocracy whispered about in taverns with half-serious dread. Illustrations showed imagined silhouettes of the Ripper with top hats pulled low and knives flashing in the moonlight. Readers devoured every word, even as those very words deepened their unease. For some, the news was an addiction. For others, it was a torment. But nearly all who lived in the East End could not resist peeking at the latest broadsheet, even if it made them tremble. The police, for their part, were unravelling under the public eye. Scotland Yard sent more men into Whitechapel, but the maze of crooked lanes, shadowed courts, and endless alleys swallowed them whole. Uniformed constables patrolled at night with lanterns and whistles, but their presence brought little comfort. Too many believed the killer walked among them, blending seamlessly into the very crowd of onlookers who gathered at each crime scene. How could a handful of lanterns pierce through the fog of both the streets and the imagination? Women of the district, particularly those who worked the streets for survival, were the most shaken. They huddled together at corners, whispering bargains with customers, but always with eyes darting about. Some carried makeshift weapons, hatpins, small knives, even bricks in pockets. Others vowed they would not go out at all after dark. But hunger has a way of silencing vows, and for many, the risk of the Ripper was weighed daily against the risk of starvation. More than once, a woman was seen pausing at the edge of a gaslit street, clutching her shawl tightly, whispering a prayer before stepping into the night. The fear was not abstract. It lived in their very bones. As October wore on, the Ripper's shadow seemed to grow larger than the man himself. He became a figure of legend before the legend was finished being written. Children whispered about him in alleys, daring one another to walk alone down darkened lanes. Drunken men in pubs swore they had seen him, a tall figure slipping into Mitre Square, a stranger leaning too close near Spitalfields Market, a man with blood on his cuffs passing by Aldgate Station. None of these stories could be confirmed, but each retelling gave the Ripper new faces, new habits, new disguises. The killer became everyone and no one at once. The Dear Boss letter and the bloody postcard that followed, both sent to the Central News Agency, only deepened the frenzy. The letter had mocked the police and signed off with the now famous name, a Jack the Ripper. Whether genuine or not, the name caught like fire. Overnight, the faceless murderer was given a persona, a signature, an identity that was more terrifying than anonymity. Jack the Ripper, it was not just a killer in Whitechapel. He was now a character in the public imagination, one who seemed almost to delight in his work. That thought, that the killer might be amused by the suffering, gave the fear an extra edge. And yet, life in London continued, for it had no choice. The great carriages of the wealthy still rolled down wide avenues in the West End. Opera houses and theatres still opened their doors at night. Gentlemen still smoked their pipes in private clubs, discussing business, politics, and, inevitably, the murders. But even in those refined spaces, the Ripper intruded. No one could ignore him, for the newspapers delivered his presence to every breakfast table, every tavern bench, every lonely corner of the East End where candlelight flickered weakly against the dark. The East End itself, already burdened by poverty and crime, seemed now to be under siege. The lodging houses overflowed each night with men and women too poor to afford more than a shared bed for a few pennies. The smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and damp wood pressed down on the senses. In these crowded, airless spaces, conversations circled endlessly back to the Ripper. Who do you think it is? Did you hear about the apron found in Goulston Street? They say he's a doctor. That's why he cuts the way he does. Theories multiplied like rats, and like rats, they carried their own kind of disease, the disease of suspicion. Friends looked sideways at friends. Strangers were viewed with instant distrust. The East End had always been rough, but now it was wary too. The Jewish community in Whitechapel bore an especially heavy weight of that suspicion. When graffiti was found near one of the murder sites, declaring in chalk that the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, attentions flared. Police quickly erased the message for fear it would ignite violence, but the memory of it lingered. Anti-Semitic mutterings crept into tavern corners and spilled out into the streets. Immigrants, already living on the margins, now carried the added burden of being scapegoats for a terror none of them had caused. The Ripper's blade had not only cut into his victims, it had cut into the fragile fabric of the community itself. Through it all, the fog continued to roll in from the Thames, veiling the gas lamps, muting the sound of footsteps, and deepening the gloom. On such nights, when the mist thickened and the lamps became pale blurs in the darkness, Whitechapel seemed less like part of London and more like another world entirely, a world where a killer could pass within arm's reach, unseen and unchallenged. Those nights were the hardest to endure. People spoke less, moved faster, and tried not to let their minds wander into the possibilities of what might be lurking only a few feet away. The press kept the story alive with each passing day. Journalists prowled the streets, not unlike the killer himself, sniffing for fresh details, chasing whispers, interviewing constables, lodging house keepers, and anyone who would speak. Many articles blurred the line between fact and imagination, yet the public devoured them all the same. For every actual development, there were 10 rumors printed as though they were gospel truth. The Ripper was both everywhere and nowhere, and the city itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his presence. By late October, Whitechapel had grown weary of the fear, though not numb to it. The killings had not stopped, but the waiting had become its own kind of torment. Each day without a murder was both a relief and a tightening of the noose, for it meant the next strike was only postponed, not prevented. The people of Whitechapel carried on with their lives, because they had to, but it was life under a shadow, life with the constant awareness that death could come swiftly, silently, and without warning. And so the city stood on edge. The fear was no longer confined to Whitechapel alone. It had spread outward, carried by newspapers and whispers, carried by the fascination of those who lived far from the narrow alleys where the murders had taken place. London itself seemed to pause, waiting for the next headline, the next horror, the next chapter in the story of Jack the Ripper. The killer had done more than take lives. He had captured a city, and he held it in his unseen hand, squeezing just enough to remind everyone that he was still there, somewhere, walking among them. Chapter 9. The Long Shadow of Fear. London, after the bloody autumn of 1888, carried a heaviness in the air that clung like the coal smoke rising from chimneys. The murders had shaken the East End to its bones, and though the frantic weeks of discovery, police chases, and newspaper headlines had passed, the shadow of Jack the Ripper still lingered. It was not a shadow that simply vanished once the killings quieted down. Instead, it stayed, stretched across Whitechapel's alleys and market squares, across the minds of its poorest inhabitants, across the words of journalists still hungry for stories, and across the desks of detectives still buried under stacks of witness statements and unanswered questions. By the winter months, the panic of September and October had dulled, but it did not vanish. Instead, it transformed into something slower, deeper, and perhaps more corrosive. People no longer ran to every darkened corner believing a murderer might be waiting there, but the memory of his presence became part of daily life. When women stepped out at night, they still glanced over their shoulders. When men lingered at taverns, they still spoke of him in lowered voices. And when the fog rolled thick through the streets, a silence often followed, as though the city itself held its breath, uncertain if the Ripper's blade might once again find its mark. The East End of London had never been a place of peace. Even before the killings, it was a district marked by grinding poverty, overcrowded dwellings, and ceaseless toil. But the murders had added something else, a kind of weight, a permanent association of those crooked lanes and lodging houses with dread. And as the winter of 1888 turned into the early months of 1889, that dread did not ease. Instead, it spread like damp through the walls of the tenements, becoming part of the neighborhood's very identity. Day by day, ordinary life struggled on. Market stalls still opened in the mornings, their sellers calling out over baskets of wilted vegetables and cheap fish. Children still played in the gutters, darting barefoot between carts. Dock workers trudged to the river, carrying sacks and crates under the drizzle. But no matter what people did, the shadow of the murders was never entirely absent. It appeared in the cautious steps of a woman walking home, in the muttered conversation of two policemen at their nightly patrol, and in the constant stream of gossip that drifted between pubs and doorways. The newspapers, of course, had not let go of the story. They had shaped Jack the Ripper into something larger than life, not just a criminal, but a figure of dark mystery. They had given him a name that echoed far beyond Whitechapel. Even as the months passed without new killings, editors knew that the word a Ripper still sold papers. Each week brought new speculation. Was he a doctor who had fled the country? Was he a sailor now voyaging far from London? Was he a butcher hiding in plain sight? The stories were endless, and each one, no matter how far-fetched, found its audience. For the police, the passing of time brought little relief. The files grew thicker, the reports piled higher, yet no clear suspect emerged. Detectives argued among themselves, each clinging to a favorite theory, each unwilling to admit defeat. One officer insisted the killer was local, blending among the lodging houses. Another believed he had been a visitor, someone who had struck and vanished. Still others were convinced the killer was dead, his identity buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in London. But no matter how many theories were proposed, the truth remained just out of reach. And with every week that passed, the trail grew colder. Meanwhile, in Whitechapel itself, the people had to endure the daily reality of fear. Imagine a woman of the district in early 1889, worn down by years of hardship, struggling to make a few pennies selling matches or flowers. She must return home late, walking through narrow streets that still remembered the Ripper's footsteps. She pulls her shawl tightly around her shoulders, hurrying beneath flickering gas lamps, half expecting to hear another set of footsteps echoing behind her. She has no choice but to continue. Poverty offers no protection, no refuge. And so, though the murders have paused, the fear of them still dictates the rhythm of her life. Taverns and pubs echoed with the same stories over and over again. Men swore they had seen someone suspicious, a tall figure slipping into the fog, a stranger who asked too many questions, a lodger who came and went at odd hours. Each tale added fuel to the fire, and yet none brought certainty. The Ripper became not just one man but many, a figure onto whom suspicion could be projected at will. For some, he was a foreigner, an outsider who did not belong. For others, he was a gentleman in disguise, his wealth hiding his crimes. For still others, he was the man next door, his ordinary appearance making him all the more terrifying. This uncertainty created its own form of paralysis. People distrusted one another. A stranger's glance could spark unease. A neighbor's absence might be noted with suspicion. And the police, burdened by criticism and failure, found themselves unable to restore confidence. The Ripper had not only murdered women, he had also murdered a sense of safety, and that wound was not easily healed. As the seasons changed, the Ripper's legend only grew. He was no longer merely a killer haunting the East End. He had become a symbol of the dangers of modern cities, of the failures of law enforcement, of the vulnerability of the poor. Writers used him as a warning, politicians invoked him as evidence of social decay, and preachers pointed to him as proof of sin festering in the heart of London. Thus, even in his silence, he continued to shape the city. By the spring of 1889, some had begun to whisper that the Ripper would never return. Perhaps he had gone elsewhere, perhaps he had been imprisoned for another crime, perhaps he had even taken his own life. But the fear did not fade. Whitechapel had become his stage, and the residents his unwilling audience. Each shadow, each creak of a door, each brush of footsteps in the dark carried with it the faint echo of his presence. And so London moved forward, yet always looking backward over its shoulder. The killer had vanished into the mist, but the long shadow of fear remained. In the crowded streets of Whitechapel, life carried on, but no one forgot. And as time passed, the story of Jack the Ripper slipped from fresh horror into enduring legend, a legend that still tightened the hearts of those who walked the streets at night. And a legend that the world beyond London would carry for generations. Chapter 10: The Shadow That Never Lifted. In the years that followed the autumn of 1888, London slowly exhaled a shaky breath. The killings that had once dominated every headline, every whisper in the pubs and lodging houses, had finally ceased. But the absence of new murders did not mean relief. Instead, it left a hollow silence, a silence filled with questions that no one could answer. Jack the Ripper had vanished as abruptly as he had appeared, and in his wake he left not only the bodies of women, but a city permanently scarred, a district forever marked. And a legend that would continue to grow long after the gas lamps of Whitechapel had been replaced by electricity. The narrow alleys of the East End carried on much as they always had. The market stalls opened each morning, selling cheap cuts of meat, vegetables of questionable freshness, and second-hand clothes worn thin by years of use. The costermongers called out their wares, children darted barefoot through puddles, and men trudged to the docks for work that paid just enough to survive another day. Yet beneath this hum of daily life lay an unease that refused to be banished. For months, Londoners had been taught that at any moment, in the dead of night, someone might strike with surgical precision and pitiless cruelty. That kind of fear does not dissolve quickly. It lingers, seeping into the bricks and cobblestones, staining memory with dread. In the police stations of the Metropolitan Police, the files remained open but grew dusty. Detectives who had once worked feverishly, chasing every lead, interrogating countless suspects, and patrolling Whitechapel's labyrinth of alleys through the fog, began to accept the bitter truth: Jack the Ripper had slipped through their fingers. Inspector Frederick Abeline, who had poured his energy into the hunt, carried the weight of failure long after the case had gone cold. He would retire with his reputation intact, yet with the knowledge that the most infamous killer of his career had never been brought to justice. Theories continued to swirl, some whispered in taverns, others printed boldly in newspapers. Was the Ripper a doctor with an unusual knowledge of anatomy? A butcher accustomed to knives and blood? A foreign sailor who drifted into port and vanished just as easily? Some even claimed he was a wealthy gentleman, slumming in the East End for reasons too dark to imagine. Each possibility was explored, debated, and abandoned. Without evidence, they were but stories, filling the void left by the murderer's silence. For the women of Whitechapel, survival remained as difficult as ever. The murders had shone a brief, harsh light on their plight, but with the killings over, sympathy waned. Poverty still drove many to the streets, to sell themselves for a few pence to men who could afford no more. The lodging houses still smelled of damp and unwashed bodies. Hunger still gnawed at stomachs, drink still blurred the edges of despair. In many ways, the Ripper's end changed little for them. They lived as they had before, in danger, in hardship, always one misfortune away from ruin. The press, which had feasted on the story with sensational headlines, could not let go so easily. Even without fresh murders, the name Jack the Ripper sold papers. Columns revisited the crimes, described them in grisly detail, speculated on the killer's identity, and printed letters that claimed to come from him. Most were hoaxes, crude imitations, yet each new letter sparked fresh discussion. Readers, fascinated and horrified, could not resist returning to the tale. And so the Ripper lived on in ink, his shadow stretching across the years, long after his knife had been sheathed. As time passed, Jack the Ripper became something larger than a man. He was no longer merely a killer stalking the slums. He became a symbol of the city's darkest fears, a figure who represented the unknown dangers lurking in the fog. He embodied the failures of society, the police unable to protect, the press eager to exploit, the poor left to suffer. In Whitechapel, the locals rarely spoke his name, preferring to let the memory fade, but in the wider world, he was immortalized. His crimes were recounted in parlours and lecture halls, in penny dreadfuls and in serious criminological debates. The mystery of his identity ensured that interest never waned, for nothing grips the imagination like an unsolved crime. For those who had lived through it, however, the fear was not abstract. They remembered the nights when women refused to walk alone, when footsteps behind them made their hearts race, when shadows seemed alive with menace. They remembered the bodies found in dark corners, the police whistles cutting through the silence, the crowds gathering to peer at scenes they could not unsee. They remembered how close danger had come to their own lives, and they carried that memory quietly, long after the newspapers had moved on. And so the years turned. Whitechapel changed slowly, its streets gradually altered by new buildings, new industries, and waves of immigrants who brought fresh cultures to the district. Yet the old alleys remained, and with them the echoes of 1888. Visitors would come, curious to see the places where the Ripper had walked, where his victims had been found. Locals sometimes resented this morbid fascination, for to them these were not stories but tragedies, lived and felt. Jack the Ripper never struck again, but he never left. His shadow remained, stretching across history, growing longer with each retelling. For more than a century, his name has endured when others have been forgotten. The women he killed are often remembered only because of him, their lives eclipsed by the violence of their deaths. Yet in truth, their stories are the heart of the tale, for without them there would be no Ripper. They were daughters, mothers, friends, women of flesh and blood, forced by poverty into desperate circumstances. Remembering them is to remember the world that created Jack the Ripper, a world of inequality, of neglect, of lives lived on the edge of survival. And so, in the stillness of history, the figure of the Ripper lingers. His identity remains unknown, his crimes unsolved. Perhaps that is why his story has endured, because the unanswered questions leave space for imagination, for fear, for endless speculation. He is not merely a man of the past, but a ghost who refuses to fade, haunting the streets of Whitechapel, haunting the pages of books and the screens of films, haunting the restless corners of the human mind. The gas lamps of 1888 are long extinguished. The cobblestones are worn smooth by time. The voices of those who lived in fear are silent now. But the shadow remains, and with it the uneasy knowledge that